Why is it? I don't. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Activity Strong Executive Edition webinar. My name is Meg Laporte, and I am a member of the Linked Senior Marketing Team. For today's webinar, we are providing one free NAB, NCAP, NCCDP, NCTRC, and NZSRDT CEU credit. To be eligible for CEO credits, you need to remain on this webinar for the full hour. And at the end of the webinar, I will provide you with a post-webinar CEU survey evaluation link in the webinar chat box. And it will also be sent to all attendees by email this afternoon. So please check your spam folder. The survey must be completed by midnight Eastern time this Thursday. And if you have any questions, please email us at webinars@linksenior.com. CEU surveys will be issued by email before the end of the day Friday. And I see some hands up, and I think I need to correct the chat, so I will make sure everyone can use the chat box. So, and there we go. Folks can introduce themselves, should be able to introduce themselves via the chat now, and I'm going to give it to you now, Charles. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meg. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Lashwan. Excited to have you. So like Meg mentioned, my name is Charles Vermoen, and I am with Linked Senior. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Linked Senior. Very excited to be with you all. This is, like Meg mentioned, our executive edition of Activity Strong. So taking a step back, Activity Strong was started by Linked Senior to acknowledge and empower and educate activity and life enrichment professionals, but also anyone in senior living interested in this notion of engagement. And a couple years ago, we started to do another track called the Executive Edition to try to attract everyone, including people from different level within senior living organizations. And so that's why we're very excited to have this webinar today on expanding cultural diversity in senior living. Before we get started, also as a reminder, Activity Strong is done in partnership with Activity Connection, NAP, and NCAP. So talking a little bit about the organization behind it, we're very value driven. As you might know, we started something called Old People Are Cool, and it's us not being fan of segregation based on age. We think that everyone is cool. My 4 kids have a t-shirt that say old people are cool, and it's all about celebrating the individual beings. And obviously Activity Strong, like I mentioned, is really us to help out and support the senior living industry. Linked Senior itself is a company that I had the honor of co-founding a few years ago. We provide what's called resident engagement. We're lucky to partner with amazing organizations and to actually touch the lives of 50,000 residents in the US and Canada. We're proud of our work. It's all about helping you do what you love, which is to be with residents and help them find purpose. And so you can find purpose in helping them find purpose. And proud also of our work because it is quote unquote evidence-based. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Excited to have a conversation with any one of you. As we start this program itself, also, just as a quick reminder, the chat gets really busy, which is a great thing. If you have questions for our speaker today, please gear them towards the Q&A feature. It's easier for us to filter them. And then the other thing is, as you're using the chat, make sure you select everyone so that everyone can benefit from your contribution. So with that, I wanted to share one quick word, one good of introduction, which is that we know in life enrichment and activities, the one driver of our work, the one reason we are good or we show up at work is for what's called person-directed living. And one of my mentors in this field of diversity, which I continue to learn every day, Marvell Adams, once told me that it's very difficult for us to consider to be good at person-directed living if we do not include our team members and diversity in that aspect. And so that's why I'm so excited to be welcoming LaShawn Bethea, who's the Executive Director of the National Center for Assisted Living, NCAL, who's going to be talking about that topic. And as I unshare my screen to let you share your screen, LaShawn, I just want to welcome you again. Thank you for the opportunity to learn from you. I'll be camera off, but should you need anything, please let me know.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I am sharing my screen right now. Here we go. Thank you
Yeah,
again so
perfect.
much for this opportunity to be able to speak with you all. I'm excited that there are so many people attending this presentation today. I'd like for this presentation to be really interactive. And so as I go through the discussion, please feel free to ask questions in the chat in real time, share scenarios in the chat in real time. I think that it will help you get more out of it. It will definitely help guide us along this presentation. So again, we're going to be talking about expanding cultural diversity in senior living. And before I dive too deep into the discussion, one of the things I thought about as I was preparing for this discussion is, what do we do, on a day-to-day basis? And before I get into that discussion, I wanted to share a little bit about myself and what my experience and why this topic is really so important to me. I've worked in long-term care for over 20 years, and really it has been my experience that, with the exception of one place that I have worked, that the food that I eat, the holiday experiences and celebrations that I have, the activities that I enjoy either participating in or watching, or just what I consider to be customary and routine, really mimics what my experiences have been with my residents working either in a nursing home or in long-term care or in assisted living. And so the culture that I've experienced in my personal life mimics very closely the culture of my work life and the culture that I've shared with the many residents that I have taken care of. And there's really only been one exception to that, in that I've had a privilege of working in a Jewish nursing home, and I'm not Jewish, so the culture was very different, from the food that the residents ate to the holiday celebrations or the days of observance. And what was even considered customary and routine was very different from what I experienced in my personal life. And so as I reflect on those experiences, I thought how fortunate that it is for me that when the time comes that I will need a little or even a lot of help with my daily needs, that there will be very little disruption to my identity, to my values, to my beliefs. But I also know that that's not the case for everyone. And so, what we're going to talk about today is, how do we expand? How do we create some normalcy in cultural diversity? And so I want to share with you this quote, which is that we spend a lot of time designing the bridge, but not enough time thinking about the people who cross the bridge. And so this quote came from Dr. Singh, and he's a physician and author of a book called Dying and Living in the Neighborhood. And so he also walked through his journey of what it's like to be with or in an environment that is culturally diverse and that integrates cultural diversity in healthcare and in living, and also what it is like to be in an environment where that is not the case. And so when we think about what the bridge is really the processes that we follow to complete those daily tasks. The bridges are really like the boxes that we check every day that allow us to be able to say we've gotten the job done. And so when we're designing the bridge, we think about the things that we do and how we do them more efficiently, how we do them more effectively. That's what we're thinking about when we talk about designing the bridge. But the people who cross the bridge are really the recipients of those boxes that we check and that the work that we do. And so today we're really going to be spending a lot more time thinking about the people that cross the bridge, also known as our residents and the people that live in our assisted living communities and the long-term care communities or nursing homes. but also thinking about the people who provide care to them, some of which may be you. So I'm going to start by, making it a real practical example. I want to put faces. So I talked about myself, but now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Miss Jackson. So Miss Jackson is living in an assisted living community. She's 101 years old, and she was actually born in England, but now lives in the United States. She was married she was married and her husband passed a few years ago. And her religion is that she's a Jehovah's Witness. And so this is just a little bit about Miss Jackson, and it may give you a little bit of an idea of what her upbringing is and what her culture is. And we'll talk a little bit about what culture is, but I want you to think about Miss Jackson. And as we learn about what culture is and how it influences who we are and our behaviors, I want you to think about how Miss Jackson might be influenced, or how her decision making. And I also want you to think about how Miss Jackson might relate to the other residents that are in her assisted living community. How will she relate to the staff? Will they understand her? Will they have the knowledge and ability to respect her religious beliefs? Because she didn't grow up in America, but she's lived here for a little while with her family, basically about the last 5 years or so. So the majority of the time she spent in England. But she's, again, 100 years old. She's had a long life living in England and probably has seen a lot of things. And so I would imagine that the days that she observes or recognizes, and the holidays that she celebrates, it might be a little different than what she is going to be exposed to in the United States. And so this is an opportunity not just to educate the staff that is caring for her, or the other residents that call their home, the place where she lives, their home as well, but it is also an opportunity to educate Ms. Jackson as well. So again, as we go through this, I want you to think about Ms. Jackson. I also want to introduce you to Mr. O'Donnell. Mr. O'Donnell lives in an assisted living community, but also spent some time in a nursing home at one point because he had an injury, had a fall. And now he's back in his assisted living community. And he was born and raised in Australia, but now lives in the United States. A little bit of history about Mr. O'Donnell is that he did play cricket as a kid and as a young adult, and he enjoys watching it on television. He has some of his favorite foods that he ate all the way up until when he left Australia, which is he loved meat pie, and he also, one of his favorite holidays to celebrate is Australia Day. He celebrates that every year. It's very meaningful to him. He came to the United States in 2019, just right before the pandemic. So a very different United States than probably the one that he would watch on TV or knew about, because we were going into the pandemic. Mr. O'Donnell is also Catholic. So like Ms. Jackson, I want you to think about, will the other residents that he interacts with have the knowledge or ability to respect his religion, to understand his celebratory preferences? Will he be able to communicate with them, effectively? And so we're going to talk again a little bit about culture and how bringing culture diversity not only helps our residents like Ms. Jackson and Mr. O'Donnell, but it also helps the other residents that are interacting with both of those residents, as well as the staff that have to care for them every day. So the purpose of our presentation is really to help us not only understand about cultural diversity, what culture is, but how there is a strong connection between understanding cultural diversity and culture in general, and our ability to be able to provide person-centered care, that individualized care that we seek to provide to our residents every day. We're going to learn about what opportunities that we have to be able to expand cultural diversity in our communities, but also how we expand cultural awareness, not only amongst our residents, but also their families and our staff as well. So I want to take some time to reflect. Again, one of the things that helps us to be able to remember this long beyond this presentation is really to reflect on our own lives. And I talked about my own life earlier and how fortunate I am that when the time comes where I need some extra assistance, that while I'll be in a period where I'll be going through mourning my level of independence because now I need a little bit more help, there will be very little that will change in terms of my culture, the food that I eat, the music that I listen to, the activities that I enjoy watching on television, because I might not likely be participating them in person. So there will be very little disruption to that part of my culture. And so as we dive into understanding culture and how we connect it to person-centered care, I want us to think a little bit about sustainability. Again, how do we take what we learned today, what we discussed today, into our own communities, and how do we create an environment where it is sustainable long beyond when we are there? And we want to take this to thinking about how important it is to put ourselves in the shoes of the residents that we care for and the staff that care for them. We need to think about our own lives. Again, what music do we listen to? Will we have the ability to access that when we are in the senior living community? Do our residents currently have that ability to listen to that music that they listen to? Do they have the ability to retain celebrating those holidays that they grew up celebrating, that they celebrated when they had their own level of independence? The same thing with their foods or the activities and even the languages that they speak. Do they have individuals that they can connect with that also speak those languages? And what can we do to help ensure that they have some connection to their culture? So when we think about culture, we've talked a lot about it over the last couple of slides. We talked about it when I gave you a little bit of background on Ms. Jackson, when I gave you a little bit of background on Mr. O'Donnell. But what really is it? What are we talking about when I mention the word culture? Culture can be defined in many ways. If you Google it, you'll see a handful, maybe a half a dozen or so different examples of what is culture. But in short, it really is something that shapes our identity and influences our behavior. In short, it's really a way of being. And so culture can be linked to many things. It can be tied to race. It can be tied to religion, but it also can be tied to a period of time. It can be tied to a specific location. And a perfect example of that I will give you is that, you know, when we think about people who live in Texas, who are living a life that is entrenched in country and Western, you might think of cowboy boots and riding horses, and you might think of cowboy or cowgirl, you know, hats. That is a part of a culture that is linked to a specific location. When you think about the 60s, you might think about the types of clothing that they wore at that time. That is culture that's linked to a time period. And so when we think about culture, we need to think about it in the broader sense, and that it can be linked to race and religion, but it also can be linked to things like a specific period of time or a specific location. And it does shape how we dress, what we eat, what we value. And so when we think about Miss Jackson or Mr. O'Donnell, we can think about where they live, how old they are, and the time period in which they grew up in shapes their perspective. And it definitely has an impact on how they interact with each other. And I think we saw this not just in their examples, but in our communities or in our nursing homes during the pandemic, where people had very different views about their perspective on the vaccine. And a lot of that was shaped by culture, different aspects of culture for different individuals. And so culture does influence what we eat. It definitely influences our perspectives on treatment. It influences our perspectives on healthcare and our decision-making as well. Understanding culture is also known as cultural awareness. So although you may not know everything about an individual who grew up in England or an individual who grew up in Australia, or being 100 years old and what it's like, knowing that that person is likely to have a different perspective, a different thought process that shapes the way they think, that may shape their perspective, that awareness, that openness will allow you to ask the questions, which will allow you then to have some respect for their beliefs, their values, what they deem to be normal. And so then you're able to express that by respecting their differences of opinions. So recently I had the opportunity to read a research paper called Infusing Culture into Long-Term Care Environments to Improve Public Health and Quality of Life Experience. And they looked at the connection between cultural diversity and person-centered care in respect to quality of life. And they used Hawaii as an example. They looked at the cultural diversity in Hawaii, and they looked at the staff's ability to be able to provide person-centered care and its outcome on quality of life. And in this journal or in this article, one of the outcomes or one of the things that they said is that quality of life is closely related to the quality of the residents and the resident to staff relationship. And so this residence to staff relationship is closely connected to that staff person's ability to have some cultural awareness and be able to relate to and respect that individual's cultural preferences. So whether it be their food choices, their activity preferences, or their healthcare decisions, the ability to be able to understand that allows that resident one to feel respected, but it also increases that resident's quality of life because they have a better resident staff relationship. So that takes me to cultural competence. And so what is cultural competence? Like cultural diversity, or like the word culture, it does have a lot of different definitions. But in short, really what cultural competence is, it is our ability to understand, our ability to appreciate and interact with people from cultures or beliefs different from our own. And so the first step of cultural competence is really understanding what is our own culture. What is your own culture? What do you expect in terms of the music that you listen to, the food that you eat? You know, what is it that you are used to and what are your expectations around that? And then you can have an understanding of how it might be different from others that you're caring for or others that you're interacting with. And it really helps to identify an opportunity for learning, because when you identify or when you see that there are individuals that you are caring for or staff that you are interacting with that have different preferences than you, then you know that there is some opportunity for you to learn more, one, about that individual so that you can better be prepared to respect or acknowledge those differences. But also there's an opportunity for them to learn about you as well. So one of the examples that I wanted to talk about when we think about cultural competence is something that also came up, a personal experience that also came up during the pandemic, particularly around staff having to, or discussing the vaccine with staff. And one of the things that we experience in the United States is that there are a lot of individuals here of color, but they all come from different areas. And so one of the things that I think is important to raise in terms of the importance of cultural competence is that, you know, in this particular community that I went into to talk about vaccine acceptance, there were individuals there that were African American, that were Nigerian, and that were Jamaican, all individuals of color, but they all had very different backgrounds. And while each one of their stories related to discussing their comfortableness with, or their comfort level with accepting the vaccine, was very different. It came from, some were religious based, some were historical based, but it was very different. And so, you know, I think it was important at that very moment for other staff to hear that one size doesn't fit all. Someone who might have an experience growing up in America who has some vaccine hesitancy, it might be very different from someone who grew up in another country who has very little knowledge about that historical history, but also has some religious hesitancy related to the vaccine. Again, looking at someone and saying they might look very similar on the outside, but understanding how they are different from a cultural perspective can help us, one, address the specific issues related to that hesitancy for that particular individual, versus kind of saying, oh, it must be this, and applying it across the board for all individuals based on what they look like on the outside. And so I bring us back to a prior statement, which is that, you know, culture can be tied to race, but it also can be tied to other things like religion, like location. And this is a perfect example of that. And I'm just checking the chat also to make sure that if anyone has any questions or any discussion points, that I can answer them or bring those discussion points up during this conversation. So that ties me to the next point, which is person-centered care. So person-centered care, we should think about a couple of things. What is it? So person-centered care is care that is responsive, meaning that it's not static and that it allows an individual to adjust that care based on the residents or the individual that's receiving the care, based on their goals, based on their preferences, and based on their values. And just thinking about that portion of the definition of person-centered care alone, you can clearly make the connection between culture and having cultural diversity and understanding how it is that you can be responsive to an individual's goals, preferences, and values. In order to be able to do that, you need to have some understanding of what those preferences are, what those goals and what those values are. But person-centered care doesn't stop there. It's not just about being responsive to goals, preferences, and values. It is also being responsive in a way that it supports communication, both between the caregiver and the recipient of that care, that it empowers not only the individual that is receiving the care, ownership in what that care looks like, but it also empowers the caregiver to make sure that they are providing that care in a way that is supporting communication, that is addressing the goals and preferences and values of that individual. But it empowers them to not just check the box, but to do it in a way that it is responsive to all of the residents' needs. But person-centered care also focuses on being collaborative. All of the stakeholders that have some role in the care of this individual have the ability to have a seat at the table and shape what that care looks like, including the recipient of the care. So when we think about person-centered care, I want you to think about it basically in two buckets: care that is not only responsive to goals, preferences, and value, but it does it in a way that is supportive, that empowers those individuals, and that creates an environment of collaboration between all of the stakeholders. So how do we integrate culture? How do we create an environment that integrates culture in our day-to-day practices? Well, that article that I spoke about, the Infusing Culture into Long-Term Care and Environment and Improving Public Health and Quality of Life, gave 4 different areas that we should focus on when we think about integrating culture. One is through communication and language. The second is through socialization and activities. The third is quality of life needs. And the fourth is organizational. And we're going to talk about each one of these. So I'm going to start with organizational, because organization is kind of the structure. Without having the appropriate organizational goals, it is very difficult to create sustainable integration of culture. And so organizational goals really looking at the mission and vision and values of the organization and seeing, do they incorporate opportunities to integrate culture? Or is there anything in the mission and vision and value that would conflict with or make it difficult for individuals, both the residents who are receiving the care, to express that they would like more of their culture integrated into the day-to-day processes of the organization, or for staff that say, hey, I see that there are opportunities for us to integrate more culture. Is there anything in the mission and vision and values that would allow that to happen? Integrating cultural competence in policies and procedures. Cultural competence is a way for us to kind of check the pulse on where our staff are at any given moment in time and where our residents are at any given moment in time. Again, with creating an environment that is respectful and open to cultural diversity, but also making sure or taking steps to have an ethnically diverse workforce. The more that you have diversity within your workforce, the more likely that you are to be in a place where you are able to integrate diversity within your organization, cultural diversity within your organization. So these are three of the steps that they have. They had several more steps. I think it was like about 8 steps that were in the organizational section, but these are 3 that I wanted to pull out that I think are things that we could look at in the short term to identify, is our organization positioned to integrate culture? The second that I'll mention is quality of life needs. And so this looks at specific needs of the residents or individuals that are in our communities, our assisted living communities, or in our nursing homes that are receiving the care. And so it asks us to look at residents' religious and spiritual affiliations. And are we doing things that allow them the opportunity to experience those religious and spirituality within our communities? It also asks us to look at resident cultural activity preferences. Are we, when we're creating activity programming for our residents, are we looking at what are the cultural norms for the residents that are in our community? And are we creating opportunity to integrate those cultural activities or norms into our activity or recreational therapy programming? It also asks us to look at things that are some of our necessities of life, which is the food or the meals that our residents eat, their wake-sleep cycles, and their preferences related to those, and other accommodations that allow residents to maintain some normalcy in their day-to-day life that would be similar to what they experienced before they came into our assisted living communities or in our nursing homes. And so I will, give you some examples of, sleep patterns. In different religious practices, people pray or have praying requirements that occur at all different times of the day and or at the night. And do we have accommodations that would allow them to be able to maintain those different, prayer requirements that they would choose to participate in? So just again, to give you an example, are we making assumptions that everyone, wakes up at 7 o'clock in the morning and goes to bed at, 9 o'clock at night, as opposed to looking at what their individual needs are based on their cultural preferences? The third is socialization and activities. And so this is another area, and this is often an area where people are looking to start to bring cultural integration into their communities. They look at, let's start with bringing it in as different types of activities. And so I've seen everything from having incorporating cultural celebrations into the activities calendar, and researching and educating staff and residents about a particular culture by celebrating or recognizing a particular cultural day of celebration or a day of acknowledgement. It's a great opportunity, again, not only to show respect to that particular resident who that may be their background, but even if you are deciding to do this where you may not have a resident that identifies with that, maybe it's a staff person, it really is an opportunity again to educate other staff and residents related to a particular cultural celebration. And I think last year or the year before, I saw quite a bit of that happen around Juneteenth. And I have another example, which we'll go to in another slide, where we saw some celebration of the Hindu holidays, again to educate people and bring more shed more light into, what are those celebrations like? What do people experience? And it makes it just our staff who might be Hindu or our staff who might be African American and celebrate Juneteenth, brings some more understanding to those days of significance. And lastly, communication and language. This is one of those areas where if you have a resident who, speaks a different language, there are some ways to incorporate that language into our day-to-day practices, without necessarily having to speak that language fluently all the time from every staff that interacts with that resident. And so it could be as simple as incorporating frequently used words to encourage all staff that might interact with that resident to know those terms or know those words, so that every staff person, not just the individual who speaks the language, has the ability to interact with that resident who speaks a different language. But also just asking residents about their preferred language. And although they may speak English, that may not be their preferred language, or they might like the opportunity to be able to have dialogue in a language that they do actually prefer, but may not use because they don't have anyone that they can communicate with. The other is to bring people in from the community who do speak fluently a language that is the resident's preferred language, so that they can have ongoing dialogue with that resident in the language that they prefer. So those are just some of the examples of how we can integrate culture into our assisted living communities. There are many other examples that you can use to start to integrate diversity into your communities. So I talked a little bit earlier about some other examples, and one is I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Miss Parvati. She was born and raised in India. She is Hindu, but now lives here in the United States, and she lives in a nursing home. She's 90 years old, and she does have family that is still here with her. She has a daughter who is a physician that works full time. And that is why Miss Parvati, she needs an extra level of care. And so that's why she's in a nursing home. And so Miss Parvati, the nursing home, was looking to figure out how can we don't have anyone in our nursing home who is Indian and who is Hindu, but the staff wants to be able to relate more to Miss Parvati. And so the staff looked at what can we do. So they talked with the resident's daughter and found that Diwali is a holiday or a day of celebration that Miss Parvati celebrated all her life and recognizes. And so the staff did some research and they looked at decorating the common areas and around the recreational area and the hallways. There are bright colors, there are use of candles. And so they did some of this research, but they also educated the staff, what is the bright, what are the bright colors representative of? What are the candles representative of? They also went out and did some fireworks, because that is also another part of the celebration. During this day, there's a 5-day celebration. During these 5 days, they added things from the Indian culture to the menu, so that not only Miss Parvati could have some of those experiences with the food, but other staff could learn, staff and residents had the opportunity to learn about the food, learn about its significance to the culture. They did bring in individuals to play music, Indian music, Hindu music, so that the staff and the resident could experience, have kind of a piece of what it would be like if she were in India and experiencing, this holiday. There were individuals that came in from the community and wore the traditional Indian clothing, and they told stories about the history of the holiday. They told stories about what it was like to, live in different parts of India. And this was very helpful to Miss Parvati to be able to reminisce on what it was like to be able to live in India. But it was also an experience for the other residents. It was also an experience for the staff, who had now this new opportunity to learn about Miss Parvati, what her life was like. And they learned it all through celebrating this particular holiday. And so this is just, again, an example of how we can take opportunity to learn about cultural diversity one day at a time, one educational opportunity at a time. I want to share with you one more example, and that is about Mr. Jacobson. Mr. Jacobson is an 84-year-old. He didn't live out of the country, unlike some of the other residents that we talked about, he lived right here. And he was born in New York City. He lived his whole life in New York City. He was a retired banker and a very successful one at that. He needed a little bit more help. He was living independently. He needed a little bit more help. So his daughter moved him into an assisted living community in Kentucky. And so if you can imagine a New Yorker going to Kentucky, where you spent your whole life in New York, you can imagine that that might be a little bit of a change in scenery, a change in culture for Mr. Jacobson. So the staff recognize, you know, hey, this is a completely different environment for Mr. Jacobson. He's never, you know, lived in Kentucky. He's never been to Kentucky before. He's used to the rustle and bustle of New York City. And so the staff decided to do a little bit of, you know, how do we help somebody get used to get used to Kentucky, but also how do we bring a little bit of New York City to Kentucky as well? And so they did an event, a city meets country event. And at that event, they had people who talked about what it's like to live in New York City. They even had Mr. Jacobson tell what it's like to work on Wall Street and what it's like to be a banker in New York City. And so there was a robust exchange of stories from not only the residents, but also from the staff of what it's like to live in Kentucky. But Mr. Jacobson, who, although he needed some physical assistance, he mentally was there 100%, was able to share, you know, his life story of what it's like to live in New York City. They had a little bit of music. So they had some country western, they had some blues music, and they basically brought music from what it's like, you know, what is music in New York City and what did Mr. Jacobson listen to, but they had a live band that also played that gave a little bit of a country feel and what music is like in Kentucky. They had a Southern cuisine to introduce Mr. Jacobson to some of the things that he may not have had access to or the privilege of having in New York City. They also had a photography exhibit because while they were in Kentucky, many of the residents had never been to New York. And so they took pictures of what it's like in New York in the daytime, what it's like in Wall Street, many of the things that Mr. Jacobson was able to explain and tell a story about to the other residents there. And so residents that live and grew up in Kentucky were able to see what it would be like if they lived in New York. And there was a lot of storytelling. It was great for all the residents to talk about their lives living in Kentucky and living in New York. And it was also a great learning opportunity for the staff that was there as well. So another example of what it's like to create cultural diversity. It's not just about when we have residents who come from outside of the country and now are living in the United States, but it's also about residents who might come from one part of the United States and now are living in another. So I see that we have a couple of questions. So I am going to focus on those questions. Let me see. I have residents from Somalian and they can't speak English. It's difficult to get them involved in activities, and the state wants me to create a Somalian activity calendar and I just don't know how. Any suggestions? That's a great question, Lakeisha. So one of the things I would suggest is look to see if there are any communities. So those residents came, I'm assuming, from your local community. And so see if there are any Somalian communities that are around close to where you are working, and see if there are any individuals that you might be able to reach out to or to collaborate with to identify activities that are native to that culture. That would be the first thing I would do, is to definitely reach out to see if there are local resources that can help you identify those activities. The other thing is, if any of those residents have family, reaching out to their family and hearing a little bit about what their history or knowledge is of that culture. And the third thing is, if those residents, you said those residents can't speak, it might be helpful to use an interpreter line and ask the residents themselves. Use that opportunity to collect information from the residents themselves about the things that they used to do for fun, the things that they like to enjoy watching on television. Again, not that you would could have them watch it, but it might be something that you could replicate or talk about or get pictures of or find videos of that they can then watch for enjoyment. So definitely don't underestimate the local resources that might be available that can give you more history. Also, if the residents, although they may not be able to speak English, this may be a perfect opportunity to use an interpreter to ask the residents questions about what they like or don't like. So those would be my immediate short-term suggestions. And then, of course, if the family is able to give you some background history as well, and you can start, you don't have to start big, start small, and then slowly build upon it. So that's the other piece of advice that I would give for those that are looking to integrate cultural diversity. You don't have to do a complete overhaul. You can add to what you already have. In fact, that's probably the most respectful way to integrate it, is to add to what you have and to make small tweaks so that you're incorporating different cultures into what you already have. So the next question is, how do you manage staff who have cultural diversity and may be working with residents who may have generational bias from their experiences, and it may come out towards staff because they have not been exposed to people of different cultural backgrounds, especially folks that have neurocognitive impairment? So this is a really great question. So one of the things I would start with is that it might be helpful to do some cultural sensitivity training for the staff. And the reason is that it really will help the staff be able to deal with and manage those residents who are the behaviors of those residents who may not have the ability to be able to change those biases, because if they have those neurocognitive impairments, they may be, in a period in time of their life and they're not able to move past that period. And so it will be very difficult to re-educate those residents, as you know. And so really it is about helping the staff cope and deal with some of the cultural insensitivities that they may experience because they are caring for individuals who have those neurocognitive impairments. So that would be the first thing that I would do. The second thing that I would do is, even with you doing the cultural sensitivity training, those staff still, it's not like they're able to turn off their emotions related to how they might feel, with the experiences that they may encounter with those residents who have those generational, biases. And so it is just doing a check-in with those residents, with those staff, making sure that they are comfortable, maybe even giving them, some reassignment of the residents that they care for, so that they're not constantly, barraged with the behaviors or the interactions with the residents that have those generational biases. But starting with the cultural sensitivity training for the staff, I think will go a long way again. And recognizing that you understand that they are in a challenging situation where they have to provide care to individuals who have those neurocognitive impairments, but also have those generational biases. I think showing that you understand that they are in that situation will go a long way in helping them cope and deal with it, but then also doing some regular routine check-ins with those staff members as well. So that's a really great question, Jennifer. The next question is that I work with a more religious group, and when I brought up celebrating the different cultural celebrations, they said that we're all Christians and it's all the same. How do I explain that, yes, they are Christians, but there are other celebrations incorporated into their culture that aren't against religion, but are familiar? An example is that I'm German American, and on December the 9th, we celebrate St. Nicholas Day because culturally, Santa Claus doesn't bring gifts on Christmas, but the holiday spirit blesses you with gifts. Santa comes on December 9th and fills your shoo, which is you leave out the night before, and treat with small toys. With treats and small toys. I think that, this, and I talked about cultural sensitivity training, in answering the last question. This is another area where cultural sensitivity training would be very helpful to help people understand that, while we are all Christians, culture is not just as simple as knowing that a person is a specific religion. There's so many nuances to culture. And so understanding that we are all different. And being able to provide person-centered care is not just about providing care to the residents. It is about also supporting the staff that are providing the care to the residents. So all of the things that we talked about through the lens of the resident for the most part, but we also need to think about it through the lens of the staff that's providing that care. I will, share with you, again, another example that I had when I had the opportunity to talk with staff in a similar situation related to cultural awareness. I had a staff person say to me that, they work in a community or in a nursing home, and they're providing care. This person was was African American, and they said, everyone that I provide care to is not African American. They are of another culture, another race than I. And we don't have any acknowledgement of even Dr. Martin Luther King's, birthday. So we celebrate, they said we celebrate Valentine's Day, we celebrate St. Patrick's Day, but we don't even acknowledge that this is a day. And although, I know that some of our residents know what it is just is hurtful to me to see that we pick and choose the holidays that we celebrate. And in this particular community, they also only celebrated and acknowledged Christian holidays. And there, as you know, we have a lot of other religions as well. And so this person was very, they were very hurt, by that. And they said, I don't know what it would be like if we got an individual in here that was of a different, a resident that was here of a different culture. Would they feel isolated because there's not a lot that represents them? And so I think really it's about education. When we think about cultural diversity, it is really about not only educating the residents, but educating the staff. And that is one of the reasons why when we think about integrating, it's important to start with the organization and making sure that the organization is creating a psychologically safe space for people to have conversations about cultural diversity and expanding cultural diversity. So I'm going to include a link to the article that I referenced a couple of times, because I think that article is a great place to start having a conversation with people who make operational decisions about whether to expand cultural diversity. I think that's a great way to start that conversation. So I'm going to stop there. I think those were all the questions that came up in the Q&A. I'm just looking at the chat now to see if there are others. Other things. Okay. Oh, there's a lot here in the chat.
I have a couple questions for you, Lashwan, if I
Okay.
may.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah. Well, sorry, before I start, thank you. That was pretty
You're
cool.
very welcome.
Yeah. What I find really interesting, and thank you for the reminder, by the way, is how much emphasis you put on the fact that diversity is not only race and religion, it's everything. And I think, obviously I knew it, but I think that's a very important reminder. And the fact that for some people, it could be generational, it could be something else. And when you were saying that, I don't know if you saw the chat, but I got, in a good way, very busy, which I think is great. I'm curious, that was not a prep question, this one, but when you do I'm just on that, what do you enjoy the most on that topic?
I enjoy the fact that people are, one, recognizing that culture is unique, not only is individually unique, and that people are open and interested in recognizing how can we expand, diversity. And so when I meet people who say, hey, we don't acknowledge Martin Luther King Day, or that makes me think, okay, there's an opportunity here. What they're saying is, I don't feel like I'm seen.
Yeah.
That's what they're saying. They say, I don't feel like I'm seen. And so what would it be like to go into a place that, even though there are no African-American residents, but where there might be African-American employees, that we could say, hey, we are going to acknowledge this day. How would that employee feel different? How would they feel seen? And how would they be much better at doing their work and connecting with the residents that they care for every day?
Yeah. When you said the word need, in dementia care, we have this notion of unmet need, which leads to behavior expressions, which leads to, unfortunately, these antipsychotics medication. But you could peel off a lot, and with some of your recommendation, actually do a lot if we're able to operationalize. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, one of the things that we should think about is when we have someone who cannot communicate with us in the traditional way, who might be exhibiting behaviors, are there things that we can do to take them back to a place that is comfortable? Whether it's food, whether it's music, whether it's showing them activities that they once participated in. And so again, it's diving or peeling back, as you say, the layers of who this person is and finding things that that they find comfort in. And so I ask that we think about that in our own selves. Imagine being in a world where nothing looks like what you find comfortable. And that's what it's like to be in a place where there is no culture, or the culture doesn't reflect what makes you comfortable, what makes what you call home home.
Yeah. Yeah. So, the other question I had for you, this one is looking forward. I mean, obviously within Cal, I'm sure, well, I'm going to just venture to say that you interact with a lot of organization. And I'm sure that you see some that take these concepts that are just better or faster or quicker, more efficient in implementing them than others. And I was wondering if you had anything to share about, you know, these more successful versus the ones that are the least. Like, what do you think makes an organization more successful, quicker at embracing more diversity?
Sure. So one I would say is that, the I talked about on the slide about looking at your mission, looking at your vision. And if you are a mission driven organization, looking at your mission and seeing that it does create opportunity, it creates what we call psychological safety for people to go into a realm that they haven't gone
Yeah.
into. And so are they safe to kind of push back on the old norms and create new norms within the organization? Does your mission embrace something to that effect? And so organizations that are successful are those that have a culture already within that organization that creates psychological safety for individuals. And when I talk about psychological safety, I mean they don't have a fear of saying, hey, we want to do something different, we want to expand, and they can do that without any fear of retribution, any fear that they will be treated differently. And so I would say that those that are successful have a mission and philosophy that incorporates that, the ability to be able to open this door safely and grow safely and incorporate changes in a safe way.
The other thing that you said um, is your recommendation to start small, right? So I guess I know we're kind of running out of time here, but quickly, one or two sentence, what's the one invitation you want to invite our audience to do today or tomorrow, next week or so?
I would say start having conversations, start with your staff.
Yeah.
Start having conversations about, if we were to incorporate culture, what would you like to see? Because then you get some buy-in from them. You can start to have conversations about what do they think about as culture. It could be as simple as having an item on the menu um, and talking about it. Or people could say, I want to learn more about what it's like to be, you know, an Indian American or a Jewish American.
Yeah.
But I would say one thing you can do is to start having conversations with your staff and ask them about culture. And then from there, you can start to expand to your residents and their family members as well.
Well, Efron, thank you so much. I loved learning from you. I love just our quick but meaningful interactions. So thank you so much. I know you're super busy,
Thank you.
and I'm sure that the audience is also very, very thankful for your time today.
Thank you.
I just, as an invitation, I'm going to share my screen here. As an invitation, everyone, if you are interested in a topic, Shwan kindly offered her email address. So if we have any questions on any part of the segment today, but also just general question about diversity, please feel free to reach out. Shwan, again, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having
Um,
me.
yeah, anytime. Just quick reminders as we wrap up today's program. We continue to have, I would say, very exciting programs. One is next week, and actually, Leshwan, it goes a little bit in our discussion today. We're partnering for a half-day event with the Center for Innovation, which is the merger of the Pioneer Network and the Greenhouse Project. And that half-day event is about reframing the culture, how we create meaningful relationship for person-directed living. And so we're very honored and excited to partner with CFI. Another segment, another webinar we have later, and I think it's the last one in December, is by Dr. Jennifer Taylor. Very excited to have her back, and she will be speaking with Dr. Tara DeLong on animal-assisted therapy in senior living. And then our first event of the year in 2024 is going to be I was making a joke earlier saying that I don't know about the speaker. I don't know how good he is. But I think the topic is great. We're going to be having our first session, and obviously, sorry, that was a bad joke. But I'll be the speaker for our first webinar of 2024, and it's going to be sharing with you some exclusive data insights about the state of resident engagement and what we see in terms of trend for the upcoming year. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining. Leshwan, again, thank you. An honor to have you. And hopefully our path will cross again. And I'd love to wish you an amazing rest of the afternoon. Thank you. Take care.